Hello, good morning. Welcome back to Music 110, Introduction to Audio Technology. I'm your host, Dr. Clint. And today we are picking up where we left off last time. We are continuing our dive into the digital audio workstation, starting by looking at how audio is treated in the digital audio workstation. Last time, just as a reminder, we focused on techniques that you can apply directly to waveforms. This time, we're going to be looking at what happens once that sound that you've applied directly to the waveform, which you're kind of thinking of like applying it directly to some tape, but the changes that you made directly to the waveform itself. Now we're going to think about how once that sound, quote unquote, leaves the tape, once it leaves the waveform, it goes through a chain or a path. It follows a path, and in that path, it gets modified as it makes its way to your speakers. So today we're starting to talk about what happens once the sound of the whatever it is that is represented in the waveform itself leaves and then is modified in ways that we won't see in the representation of the waveform and won't be written to that representation of a waveform. So what we're starting to learn about is the signal flow of a track, but I think we could also think of this as any type of signal flow that is happening within a digital audio workstation or any recording environment. So what we're going to be learning about today are some new techniques that are going to be things that we're going to do at the very beginning, and the very end points of the signal path of a piece of audio. So right when the audio sort of leaves the waveform state, the waveform stage, we're going to modify that. We're going to add some changes to it in its path. It will go through its path, and then we will talk about some changes that we can do at the very end of that path. What is important about today is this idea of a signal path of changes that are being performed on audio that you can't see represented in the waveform itself. That there is a signal flow that isn't a signal path, a sort of chain that the audio is following that is not represented on the screen of the digital audio workstation. This is an important thing to sort of get your head around because so much is happening underneath the hood, so to speak. And so we need to have a general idea of some of these concepts of how signals are being routed in order to have more control over what exactly we are doing, what exactly is happening in the DAW. So eventually I'll be talking about doing these three things: automating panning, automating the channel fader, and writing the master fader. So this is the very beginning of learning about mixing. As we go forward, we're going to learn about more increasingly sort of like nuanced and complex techniques in regards to mixing. But really, this is these concepts are really the concepts that all of that is built upon. So, before I get into demonstrating these three things, automating panning, automating the channel fader, and writing the master fader, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by signal flow. Here is a diagram of signal flow in Studio One. Take a minute to just look at this. There are a lot of things going on here. This looks incredibly complex. And it is there are so many things that they kind of have to shrink down the font to. Maybe on your end, you can't even read some of this stuff because it has to be shrunken down so much. There are arrows pointing to the right. There are arrows pointing to the left. There are instruments. There are computers. There are tracks. There are channels. There are faders. There are buses. So there's lots and lots of I guess phases. There are a lot of stopping points. There are a lot of sections here. This is a very complex, complicated system. As we go forward over the next several weeks, each of these modules will become more clear to you. We'll be learning about each of these as we go. I'm presenting them now just to emphasize that this is the big picture. This is the whole picture. Today, we're going to be looking at we're going to be looking at how we go from the track to the channel to the main fader. There are a lot of different steps in here and a lot of different ways in which the signal is being routed, but we're starting to build up our understanding. And as we go, we will start to learn more about these other modules and how they're all interconnected. I will be referring back to this lecture today because what we will find is my description of the path, the signal path from track to channel to main fader is a way to understand all of these paths. So when we have a path from channel to bus fader, or when we have a path from channel to FX fader, or when we have a path from track to an external instrument, in each of these cases, we have different modules, but the signal path works in absolutely the same way. So what is happening here? Here is one way to think about this, and I think that it helps to think about how this really complicated, complex, multi-module process is based on analog processes. So this is how it's done in a digital audio workstation. Let's look at a similar diagram from a more simple recording studio. So this is how a analog studio with early multi-track technology was set up. So all of your favorite Beach Boys recordings and Beatles recordings were recorded with this setup, basically. And Studio One or any other DAW, this more sort of like layered, more complicated setup is based on this sort of system, on the analog system. What the digital audio workstation allows us to do is add complexity. So for better or for worse. So in order for us to understand the signal flow, I think it's helpful to start from the analog studio and then move over to the digital studio. So here, what we see is on the left, there is a microphone. That's how you are recording whatever it is that whatever the music, that is where the audio is being sourced from, right? So you record a band, right? And we have when it says a snake, that really just means that it's a whole bunch of audio cables that are sort of all kind of combined, but that keep the inputs separate. So, in other words, you can plug all of these mics into this one cable. That cable can run directly to a mixer, and then it keeps all of the individual lines, all of the individual mic lines separate, so that each mic has its own input into a channel on a mixer. So you can see how that's happening. Now, each of those lines, say that I've got a mic on a guitar and a mic on a vocal. Each of the guitar and the vocal will have their own channel. As that signal, and again, this is analog, so it's in the form of an electrical signal, is passing through this channel. It is going through in from top to bottom. It is going through different knobs that are affecting that electrical signal in different ways, all the way down to the bottom where we have a fader. So this is one thing that is really important to remember when we start looking at the DAW, that when you're looking at a channel, that channel is the signal flow is going from top to bottom. So say that I'm singing into this mic. The sound of my voice is being converted into an electrical signal. It's going through this cable. Now it's going down this channel, or what we would call a channel strip, but this channel, and it's going in sequence. And the first knob is typically going to be a preamplifier. So I can adjust the gain on the input there. Then it's going to go through some filters. We'll learn about filters next time. But basically, this is going to be, I can change how much low frequency is in the waveform. I can change how much high frequency is in the waveform, and there might be some other parameters that I can modify. It's going to go to panning. We're going to learn about that today. I can pan this mono signal, so it's just one signal, right? And I can decide whether it is going to go to the left or to the right, just a little bit to the left, just a little bit to the right. And then it gets to the master fader. So it gets preamplified first, then it gets filtered, then it gets panned, then it gets the overall volume fader performed on it. It happens in that sequence, right? So the gain change happens before we get to the fader, and that would make sense, right? You would want, because if you are mixing, if I am mixing the relative volume between my voice and my guitar, I would want to use the preamplifier to make sure that my overall voice signal was nice, hot, and consistent, but not distorting. Same with my guitar. But then I would want to be able to use these faders to get the balance right between my voice and guitar without having to worry about whether the actual sound of the voice and the guitar is being affected. So it's really just like these faders are really about getting the balance right between different tracks. Okay? So here, like this is, we would think this is the input, and the input is going to go through all of this to get into where I'm going to record my audio, right? So the audio is all here in this case is all being recorded onto a multi-track tape. Now, in this situation, I'm able to do all of this mixing over here. So all of these tracks are separate. I can keep all of them. They're recorded, so like I can really fine tune the mix. These are all brought back into a mixer, go through the same process again, and that eventually goes to So that will go to my master fader, right? So while I'm mixing, I will definitely just mute all of the live inputs, because now I'm just working on mixing these 8 tracks here. And then I'm going to send this out to my master fader, and that is what I will hear in my monitors. That is what will be written to the master track, which will be a stereo. And that would be eventually what is put onto a record or a tape or a CD, whatever. So, so now you might be thinking like, wait, how does it get from a channel to the master fader? So any mixer, basically, this is how it's working. Each of these channels are hooked up to the master fader in the same exact way. So the mic goes, again, like I said before, as a mic enters a channel on a mixer or a channel in a digital audio workstation, the flow is going from top to bottom. So mic in goes through all of these things, eventually gets to the fader. Then this is going to be routed to the master fader over here. All of these tracks are the same. So they all are being fed into, you can imagine all, like if I had mics hooked into each of these channels, they'd all be fed into this same signal, this same stereo signal here. So they're all feeding down directly into this path that's going from left to right, and then that comes out to an amplifier and out to an output. So as we're thinking about input-output, this will be an important thing to think about, because as we start adding new steps, new modules along the way of a signal path, we're always thinking about input-output, and we're always thinking about how a signal can be routed to sort of like a subpath. You could kind of think of it as like you're on a hike, and you decide you're going to take a little, some sort of little loop off of the main path. That's exactly what's happening here. So in order to emphasize, let's just hear and see how this works in a digital audio workstation. So I'm going to move over to Studio One. So here I am. I've got this little splice of audio here. This is from the Hamlet reading, and I'm just going to use this to demonstrate some of what I just talked about. So here we go.
Not to be. That is the question. To be or not to be? That is the question.
So that is what we think. So this is, if we're thinking in terms of analog, this is what's on the tape. I spliced it out. I just have this one bit of the tape, right? I could change, for instance, if I wanted to normalize it. Now I've normalized it. That
to be or not to be.
That is an operation that I performed directly on the waveform itself. Now, once the audio leaves the waveform, it's going through a whole signal chain. It's going through all of those modules that we saw in the complicated diagram of Studio One. It's just that really most of those modules I have not engaged yet. I haven't really sort of turned them on yet and routed the signal through those paths. So right now I'm just kind of taking the most direct, straight path from the waveform to the master fader and out. So in order to demonstrate this, I was thinking I could do something where I mimicked that Steve Reich piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in. So the Steve Reich come out. Basically, what I want to do is to do that with this to be or not to be. And like the Steve Reich piece, I want the first statement of this audio to be the full statement, and then I think what I want to do is just loop something like this, so that we'll get the full statement to be or not to be. That is the question, and then I'll just have a loop of just this.
To be or not to be or not to be.
Okay, so, and in order to do that, I need to so I'm just splicing there. I can now copy and paste this loop down to this other track, to this second track. Now, I want to keep things neat and clean for myself, and so what? Right. So what I want to do is, I want to keep things neat and clean for myself, and I know that I'm going to do something like Steve Reich does, where I have I have two loops. One is slightly shorter than the other. So what I'm going to do is, to keep that straight, I'm going to rename these tracks, and I'm going to say loop 1, and I'm going to call this track loop 2. And this will be very useful for you guys, because when you guys are creating these sound collages, you're going to be using much more than just 2 tracks. And as these build up, it's going to be important for you to keep track of what audio what audio you are putting on each track, because as we will see next time, you are going to be putting effects onto individual channels. Okay? Now, if you have like this Hamlet reading, right, and you want to put this through some equalization, maybe you want to try to get rid of some of that electronic noise, or maybe you just want to make his voice sound more whispery, but you want to put it through a filter, and then say you're going to combine this with a piano recording, but you want to make that piano recording sound like it's on an old record, so it's kind of distorting in like an old creepy record sort of way. So you want to have one type of effect on the voice and a different type of effect on the piano. So it's important to keep them on their own track, because that track those tracks are connected to channels where you're going to be putting new signal paths onto them. So when you start adding effects, when I add that sort of, maybe let's say, distortion to the piano, I don't want that distortion to be on the vocal. So I'm saying now it's a good habit to just get in whenever I'm making whenever I have a sort of new process or a new piece of audio that I want to incorporate, I'm going to give it its own track with its own name, so that I can keep all of this straight. All right, so here I have this loop, right? I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to select loop 2, and I'm going to put it down here. So now I have 2 copies of the same loop. They are the same exact length. If I go in and zoom in very closely to and I'm going to, what I want to do is make the second copy a little bit shorter, just like Steve Reich does. So I'm going to snip off. I'm going to make sure that I'm not snapping to grid. I don't believe that I am. I'm going to snip off just a little bit at the end. And I'm just going to erase that. Okay, so I've got, you can see here these two copies of To Be or Not To Be are totally in sync now. As I repeat these over and over and over again, they will go out of phase. So let's see. So if I zoom out again, let me show you guys some stuff here. Okay, now if I select this piece of audio and I press D, it will duplicate it. Now, this is sort of like this is something that frustrates me about Studio One. As far as I know, whenever you duplicate audio, it does not sort of duplicate it right to the very end of the thing that you're duplicating. Now, basically, what I'm going to do is, if you're working in another digital audio workstation, there are ways where if you just duplicate it, it would duplicate it and copy it to the very exact end of the previous splice of audio. As far as I know, there's no way to do this in Studio One. But what I can do is duplicate this over and over and over again. Okay, and then what if I just select all of these, and then, right, so if I select all of these, and then if I go to Event, and I go to Remove Gaps, that will move them so that as soon as the first piece of audio is done on a sample level, the next one will begin. So this way, I make sure that my loops are exact. Like instead of just having to like go in and just nudge these things around each time, I can make sure that this is as close to as possible a replication of what Steve Reich did, because really this is like I'm just making two tape loops and one is a little bit shorter than the other. So again, all that I did is I selected my splice of audio. I pressed D over and over and over again. And then I go into Event, Remove Gaps. So we should see here. Again, I want to make sure that this is okay. Now, if I were to make this like if I were to try to reproduce what Steve Reich did, I mean, I'd have to make many more copies of these splices of audio than this. But really, this is just to kind of demonstrate demonstrate the process, and to just going through a couple of tips and pointers of just like little things about navigating the edit window. So here is what the whole thing sounds like. I won't play the whole thing. I'll just play like the very beginning so we can start to hear the process start.
To be or not to be? That is the question. To be or not to be? 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 Or not to be?
Okay, so you'll notice that when we got to this loop, the sound all went to the left speaker. If you're listening on headphones or if you're listening on speakers, you will have noticed that as soon as we got to this loop, all of the sound went to the left speaker. So why is that? If I go to my console view, which is my mixer, this is, again, as a reminder. So here is the full statement of the to be or to not to be. That is the question. This channel is for the loop 1 track. This channel is for the loop 2 track. So here, so again, remember, just like in a mixing board, the signal path is going from top to bottom. So again, to be or not to be or not is entering. We could think of this as the sound entering on the top and then going through whatever I put in here. I will, eventually we'll be putting effects into this channel strip here. Then it goes all the way down and then it reaches panning. So, and you can see here that both of these loops are set to be panned all the way to the left. I could pan one all the way to the right. I could pan them both all the way to the middle. And sometimes it's frustrating trying to get it exactly panned to the middle. So if I were to now, let's just kind of start in this here. So I'm going to press play, and we'll hear the to be or not to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to start messing with the panning. The reason I'm messing with the panning first is because that is the first in our signal. That is the first thing in our signal flow, the first stop in our signal flow when we're just talking about panning, channel fader, and master fader. So, right, like to be or not, like both. So one of these signals is coming down this channel, the other is coming down this channel. It will reach panning first, then it will reach the fader, then it will be just like the mixer that I showed you. Both will be sent into a signal that we can think of as flowing from left to right, and then out again. So it's like in reverse, it goes out from this master fader through any other sorts of post effects that we put on here, and then out to our speakers. So let me get this zeroed out. So here, I'll just start it.
Or not to be. Or not to be. Or not to be. Or not to be. Or not to be.
So right now, they are both centered, meaning the panning is distributing the waveform equally to left and right speakers in both channels. So we have two tracks. They both have a copy of the same audio source. One copy is slightly shorter than the other. And they both are being sent equally to left and right speakers. Now, if I go in here, and if we start from the very beginning of this loop, and I have one panned all the way to the left, and I have one panned all the way to the right, what should happen is we will hear them at the very beginning. It will sound as if it's just one track, right? Because it's the same exact thing, and it will be distributing that copy of itself equally to left and right speaker. But as soon as they get out of phase, we will hear immediately the stereo panning. So what we should hear is, because it's the same exact recording, we shouldn't hear any stereo effect. It should be as if it is in mono. But as soon as they go out of phase, it'll be very sudden that we will just hear like, oh, now we're hearing two speakers, not one. So when I say mono, it is like, well, mono would literally be one speaker. But if you have a mono signal, like one microphone, right? So one microphone only has one diaphragm that is vibrating back and forth, just like one speaker has one speaker cone that is vibrating back and forth, thinking back to how microphones and speakers are really pretty much the same design. So when this person was recorded speaking the Hamlet speech, he was speaking into one microphone. That one microphone makes one signal. If we had two microphones on his voice, we would have a stereo signal of the same take. But here we just have one microphone. So now we've made two copies of the same recording, of the same mono recording, And when they are played at the same exact time, and one is panned all the way to the left, and the other is panned all the way to the right, the result will just be that it is as if it's just one speaker, right? As if it's just one signal. But as soon as they get out of phase, we will start to hear two speakers, right? And this is an important thing to remember, that when we're talking about panning and mono versus stereo, the imaging, the spatial imaging that is produced by two speakers is all happening perceptually for us. So when we have the same exact audio copied and played at the same time in two speakers, it sounds like one speaker to us, right? We can't hear, over the left it's doing this one thing, over on the right it's doing this other thing. It sounds as if it's a speaker right in front of us. As soon as it goes, as these two go out of phase, all of a sudden it's like, oh, there are two speakers. So that's the effect we should get right after the first instance of this loop that we hear. Now that I've panned it so that one copy is all the way to the left and the other copy, loop 2, is all the way to the right. So let's listen to that.
To be or not to be or not to be or not to be or not to be.
So that's really a striking effect, right? Like so think about the difference, how different this first to be or not to be sounds from the second one versus the second one to the third one to the fourth one. And think about how the stereo effect is so jarring at first. I'm going to do it one more time.
To be or not 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 to be.
So, at least for myself, after we get past this first copy, the transition from one loop to the next one is like a very subtle shifting. But this first shift of phase is very jarring, and that's because it isn't just that these two copies, these two loops are a little bit off from one another. It's that they were perfectly in sync. So when you go from perfectly in sync to just a little bit off, that is much more of a significant transition, a much more jarring transition than any of the others.
To be or not to be or not to be.
So when we're talking about panning, and we are talking about a lot of different things. One is being able to move a single sound from left to right. But we're also talking about the overall image, the overall stereo image of the sound itself. So, in thinking about how sound is being distributed between left and right speaker, we can do lots of cool stuff with just moving sounds from left to right, and I'll demonstrate some of that in just a second. But this is also a way that we can create a sense of space. So making stereo mixes allow us to really, and there's so much that we can do based on using just two speakers. We can create so many different senses of space and depth. And in this class, we're just scratching the surface on what you can do with what we call stereo imaging. Okay, so I have now changed the panning, and what I'm going to, and again, as a reminder, I have not changed the waveform. The waveforms are the same. One is being panned all the way to the left. One is being panned all the way to the right. This loop 1 travels down the channel to the panning and goes to the left. This loop 2 travels all the way down the channel and then gets to the panning and gets moved all the way to the right. So Now I'm going to press play, and I'm going to start playing with these faders. But as a reminder, the fader happens after panning.
Or not to be, 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 or not to be.
So there's all sorts of interesting things, I think, that are happening there when I am changing the relative volume between these two different tracks, because I have one that sounds like the delay of another one, but or an echo, right? So so loop 1 sounds like an echo of loop 2 because loop 1 is slightly longer than loop 2. So as I'm playing this and I reduce the volume on the channel that has loop 1, the longer loop, it sounds like it really kind of emphasizes the echo quality. Like it sounds like a naturally occurring echo that would happen in the world.
Or not to be, or not to be, or not to be, or not to be.
But what's cool about this, the way that I have it set up, is I can make an unnatural echo. In other words, the echo is louder than the sound that's being the original that will the thing that is echoing. So in other words, an echo is like a naturally occurring copy, and because of the way that I have these two tracks set up, I can create an effect where the echo
or
is
not
louder.
To be, or not to be, or not to be, or.
So that's I think that's kind of an interesting thing that I'm able to do if I take this Steve Reich process and then I start messing around with these faders. I can make an inverted echo. Okay, so now these two tracks are leaving the track, entering the channel, going down the channel. The signal flow is getting to the being panned, then going to the volume or the faders. Then they travel over to the master fader. So just to demonstrate this really fast, I am now going to press play. We're going to hear those loops, and I'm going to change the master fader.
Not to be, or not to be, or not to be, or not to be.
So the master fader is reducing the volume of all tracks in the same way, of all tracks that are in left speaker and right speaker in the same way. Now, let me just kind of emphasize what's going on here with the combination of these three phases, these three stopping points. Panning is deciding how much of so we have the track itself, the waveform. Panning is deciding how much energy to distribute to the left or to the right. So we could think of it as like all of this waveform, all of the energy in this waveform is going to the left speaker. All of it is now going to the right speaker. When we get to the middle, I'm distributing all of that equally. So you could think of it as like 50% is going to the left and 50% of it is going to the right. And as I switch this, as I'm toggling or fading this panning back and forth, if I'm, let's say I am 50% to the left, you could think of it as like I'm sending 75% of the energy of this waveform to the left and 25 to the right. The reason I'm bringing this up is because we have to think about how multiple tracks, the panning on multiple tracks, is combining. So in other words, if I right now they are what we would call hard panned. Loop 1 is hard panned to the left. Loop 2 is hard panned to the right, meaning all of the energy in this track, in this waveform, is being sent just to the left. But if I want to maybe put 50, I'm going to the left a value of 50, and I'm going to the right a value of 50. This would be, I would be still distributing the energy of this to be or not to be equally. It's just that now loop 1 is sending 75% of its energy to the left and 25 to the right, while loop 2 is sending 75% of its energy to the right and 25 to the left. So let's hear that.
Or not to be, or not to be, or not to be.
So we're still getting that echo effect, but you might have noticed that the overall sound got a little bit more centered. In other words, it sounds as if the combination of everything, it sounds as if the energy of all of the sound in the whole mix moved. It's not as wide. Like it really it seems as if the where the sound exists moved in from the two speakers. So the reason for that obviously is we're hearing some of loop 1 in the right speaker but not most, and we're hearing some of loop 2 in the left speaker but not most. So let's say, okay, so these two are then going to emphasize again after the panning. They are then going to the fader, then to the master fader. Now, why have a fader on each channel and then a master fader? Well, imagine it like this. Say you have a whole drum set that you're recording. That means you're using at least 6 different channels just for the drum set, and you are getting the levels between these different microphones on a drum set perfect, so that maybe the snare, you want it to be, because the snare is so loud, you have the volume down somewhere around here, but the tom is not as loud, so you have the volume somewhere up here. So if you were to look at all the faders that are just on the inputs to a drum set, none of them are going to be the same. So you get all of the relative volumes between that drum set right. That then all gets sent to the master mix. And then when I change this, I'm going to change it on the guitar, the drums, everything all at the same time. So this, it makes sense how you would want to have these different stopping points, these different modules, and eventually everything is going to get collated or brought into one stereo image. But before then, these are kind of free-floating in a way. Okay, so next I want to just talk about automation, the beginning of automation, and then I promise I will be done with everything that we're talking about today. So far, we have talked about the channel as moving from top to bottom, the signal, right? The signal that's coming from the waveform is moving from top to bottom. It's passing through panning first, then through volume, then it moves over to the main, where it moves from bottom to top, and we have a fader that's on the main mix. So if I were to mix this down, what would be written to file, what would be written to a wave file, would be whatever comes out at the end here, whatever is coming out of my master channel, my main channel. Okay, so let me just now I want to talk a little bit about automation, and then we'll be done. So, automation there are two ways. Automation is something specific to the digital audio workstation. What automation is it's an ability to write or record changes in panning, changes in volume, changes in any sort of, I guess you could think, knob, any sort of fader or knob. Because it's digital, we can write and record those changes. Thinking back to that analog recording studio, there was a way to do it, but like if you were going to say have a volume fade, a very long volume fade on the entire band, like the band is slowly fading in, you would have to record the entire band onto a tape, right? So then you have the whole band playing that one riff. Then you would have to play that through a mixer and record it onto another tape where you, as the mixing engineer, are slowly fading it in. So it's like those earlier recordings are also recordings of performances done by mixing engineers. Here, we can write those changes in and we can fine-tune them. This is one really cool thing about digital audio workstations. So I can compose a very fine-tuned fader swell or a panning change and listen to it right away. So in order to demonstrate that, let's see here. I will stick with this, but I want something really kind of percussive so that I can really demonstrate. And I'm going to copy and paste our to be or not to be loop down to this fourth track that I'm going to solo. Paste. All right. And the reason I'm doing this again is because I'm doing a totally different process on this fourth track, and I'm going to be automating the volume and panning changes, and I don't want to disrupt the panning and volume that I've come to that I dialed in as I was listening to my Steve Reich loop. So I think this will become much more clearer when you see what I mean by automation. All right, I'm going to close the console view just so that we can look at this track. And I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this automated, just to keep it straight. And I'm going to zoom in and
to be.
Okay, I've got this panned all the way. It's normalized. But I have it panned all the way to the left right now. I'm going to go back into my console view and adjust that. And now it's perfectly centered. I can leave my console view. All right. Let's say I just want that "t" because that gives me a nice percussive sound.
To be.
So all I have to do is select.
To be. To be. To be. To be. To be.
All right. I'm just going to select this, and I'm going to copy, and I don't really think I need. Well, I'm just going to put a whole bunch of those as if they're like hi-hats or something. So in other words, it's just going to be a loop. It'll just be a loop of just this ta 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 ta, and let's see, that's right. Okay, so it's just going to be this. All right, and I'm going to increase the gain a little bit on this so that it sounds like this. And now, like I did before, I'm going to press D. I'm going to duplicate it several times. And I will select all of them. So I've pressed D several times, selected them all, and then if I go to Event and I go to Remove Gaps, this will bring them all together. Then if I select all of these at the same time, Shift Select, I press, oops, that's not what I wanted. Now, if I select this and let's see, there we go. Shift P, that adjusts the loop to just be So what I can do is I can automate the panning here. So whereas before I was just adjusting the panning of these two to be or not to be tracks within the channel, I can have the panning change over time and write that in. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm writing it over the top of the waveform. So the way that I do that is if I click, I think of this as like the star constellation button. It's above all of these, it's above where I see all of my tracks. To make this less confusing, I'll get rid of the inspector. It's called show animation. I think of it as the star constellation button. What this does is it's toggling between basically it's toggling between how I can change the input of the track, and then how you could kind of change the output of the track, output to the channel. So right now I've switched it to automation mode. There is this drop-down menu here that says display off. That's because it's not displaying any automation. If I go down to pan automated, we will see a line that cuts through. And it goes along the 0 line of our amplitude. And what that is telling me is that the panning is distributed 50-50 to left and right. Okay? So I can make changes. So I can literally just draw in panning changes that happen over time. So let's say I do this. Now, what we should hear is these go sweep from the right side of the stereo field to the left over the course of the loop. So let me try to do it at the beginning of the loop. Okay, I can then, let's say I want it to go back and forth. So go over the course of this loop, I want it to go from right to left and back. Okay, so this is smoothly transitioning from left to right. And again, when I'm looking at this automation, at the sort of mapping of this automation, when it's all the way to the right, 100% of this t is going to the right. When it's all the way to the left, 100% of this t is going to the left. When it's in the middle, it's 50-50. Okay, so this is like a smooth transition. I can also make it say go back and forth really quickly. So say I wanted it to alternate. And this might be familiar to you all as far as thinking about the last listening assignment, that Jlyn does a lot. She does a lot of this sort of thing where it's like she hard pans different samples and has them sort of go from left to right. John Oswald does a lot of this too. So John Oswald will take one something is very similar to what I'm doing right now. He'll take one little snippet of Michael Jackson and then have it go back and forth. So we'll hear it go back and forth for the first couple of times, and then it'll be a smooth transition from left to right at the very end of the loop. So just by doing this sort of flipping back and forth hard panning alternation, it definitely gives it a much more rhythmical quality. And as I was changing this, I think you could probably hear it sort of like these different it would start, the loop itself sort of could syncopate in different ways. So I can hard pan it. I can, decide maybe I want, some of these to go to the middle, some of these go to the all the way to the left, some of these go all the way to the right. This is something that I think that I want you guys to play with once you start creating some loops and maybe splicing, repeating a splice. So I think you can start to hear that like a lot, like the variation that you can create just by doing something simple as changing the panning in this sort of way. There are all sorts of, I could go on and on just with this one sound and panning it in different ways. I mean, that loop I could listen to for a long time. So this is automating panning. Just as to emphasize here, let's switch over to the console view, and what we should see is the panning down here flipping back and forth rather quickly. So one way to think of this is what I have drawn over the top is like itself is a signal, right? So we have we have this waveform that is an audio signal being sent down this whole channel. This second signal, which is like a control signal, is then being sent at the same time just to panning. So we have audio and we have control. And this control and the audio are mapped onto the same time map, right? Okay, let's say I want to also automate. What did I just do? I want to also automate. There we go. The volume here. So I have this. So I wanted to do something like that. Let's say. And I can do that very easily. I don't have to do that over and over and over again with my trackpad here. I can just write that in because I can also automate volume. Right now, this line is all the way at the bottom of the track, right? But if what I want to hear is something like this and go all the way up to what we should hear is the fade in over the loop, and then it should just fade in again. I can adjust the shape of this fade. Okay, So notice that I have not affected the waveform itself. This is not like a gain change that I've done directly onto the waveform. This sound, the sound of the waveform, is going through here unchanged. It is being panned, and then it is being faded. So yeah, it's being panned and then it's being faded. So all of this panning information is still there. It's still being read, all of this control information, even though we can't, at least in the beginning of this loop, hear it. And that's because of signal flow. So panning happens before we get to the fader, right? We're going from top to bottom. Then, of course, this all goes over to the master fader. So if I'm going to then have this loop go, okay, so I think you could hear that there are some interesting things you can start doing, and this is to sort of emphasize that there are really there is a purpose to have all of these steps, to have faders that go into faders that go into faders. So I was able to create this kind of interesting effect where, this fade that I have on this loop does have a sort of metrical rhythmic quality to it, especially if I put a fade on top of a fade. So I have this repeating fade over and over again, and then listen as I bring in the master fader and listen to how it really kind of makes this fade itself sound like it has a rhythmic quality. Okay, so we've covered a bunch of stuff, really. We've covered signal flow. We've covered, in other words, how we go from the audio waveform on a track to a channel to the master fader. We have talked about automating volume and panning on the channel. We talked about how those automations aren't written onto the waveform itself. It is more that the waveform passes through them. So the waveform is passing through those panning changes. It is always a mono signal. It becomes stereo when we start flipping it from channel to channel, when we make a copy of it or whatever. So it is then passing through the panning changes and then passing through the volume changes. So then those we could think of if we had a whole bunch of these automated these automated tuz. Maybe I'll just do this really quickly. I know I promised that it'd be done in a second, but just to show, I'm going to add one more track. Copy our rhythmic dude down there, our rhythmic Hamlet down there, so that we can see how this works when you have two different tracks, so we can actually really make something that is stereo. So let's see. All right, so automated 2, if I go, I'm going to leave my automation view so that I can select this audio now, right? So when I'm toggling between automation view and just like our normal edit view. If I were to now, I could select this automation and I could copy that automation, right, from one track to another, or from one piece, one section of audio to another. but I would just be copying the automation at this point. If I copy these waveforms from the edit view, non-automation view, and I press copy, and then I go down here and I press paste. Now I've copied all of these down, and you'll notice that I have copied both the waveforms and the automation from the first sort of automated track to the second one. So when I'm copying and pasting, automation will be if I'm toggling between I guess, what do they call it? If I'm toggling between showing automation on a track and not showing it, if I'm just in the normal edit view, which is not showing automation, it copies everything. Waveform, all automation. If I'm in the automation view, it's just going to copy whatever is being displayed as far as automation is concerned. So I've now copied I've made a copy of this automated track, and I've put it down below. I'm going to quickly just do a couple of variations on automation below, just to emphasize some stereo effects that we can produce. So. Okay, so I think you could see if you're just kind of following along with the ways in which I was adjusting the automation and playing around with things that there are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of all sorts of creative things that you can do when you're just dealing with panning and volume changes. And again, I'm using just one splice, like less than 1 second of audio, and I'm kind of making a lot of different musical effects happen. So I encourage you to try some of these things out. See what sorts of results you can get with different types of audio, and trying to pan things around, change volume, write it in, create some rhythmic effects, and we'll talk about it next time. See you then.